Let me tell you about my guest today. Peter Singer is an ethical and political philosopher. He is an absolute legend. He's best known for his work in bioethics and his role as one of the intellectual founders of the modern animal rights movement. Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, it's a cornerstone of ethical treatment of animals and has had far-reaching effects in both kitchens and farms right across the planet. His work is absolutely timeless. The questions that he poses for us to answer remain pertinent. His writing on factory farming and the risks that it poses to humans through pandemics is just brilliant, particularly around pig farms and the 2009 swine flu pandemic. It's an issue that is only magnifying. We all know the animal to human transmission of viruses. We all know about that very well after 2+ years of COVID, and now in Australia with the Japanese encephalitis outbreak directly linked to pig farms here in Australia. The questions about the ethics of this kind of farming are still incredibly relevant. And when it comes to climate action, after the last, 2 months here in Australia, the clear effect of a changed climate due to our way of getting energy is lying in muddy piles on the streets of Brisbane, Gympie, Lismore and Sydney. The ethics of inaction have never been more clear, and in an election year that we saw our federal government demonstrate profound inaction in the face of Australians who are in desperate need, our leaders must be held to account. They must act in the interests of our nation. We've made it their job to protect us, and it's our job that we make sure we make a good decision with our vote. So I hope that this chat with Peter Singer helps you think about some of the questions you might have for your own MP, questions that you'll ask your MP before election time, and questions that you will answer with your vote. Enjoy this conversation with Peter Singer. How you doing, Peter? You good today?
Yes, thank you. I'm doing fine.
Oh, great, man. Where in the world do we find you today, Peter?
I'm in Melbourne, not too far away.
Oh,
you're in Sydney,
lovely.
Is that right?
We are, which is somewhat subaquatic at the moment. We'll get to that because it's,
yes.
I think it's the third 1 in 100 storm we've had in a decade. And I'm like, guys, you might need to actually start calling this what it is, okay? Because it's getting a bit silly. let's be honest. I'm incredibly thrilled and honoured to speak to you today, Peter. And I think it's fair that people understand where I come from when I speak to you, because 25 years ago, 96, 98, somewhere around there, 96, 97, is when I learned how much land and how much water and indeed how much food is grown to then go into the factory farming industry that then feeds people. And to me, it seemed like, well, that's just a waste of resources, isn't it? Well, I don't want to be a part of that. And, slowly, and it happens with many people this way, chicken was first, and then red meat, and then finally fish, and then a few years later in 2002, eggs. And it's been that way ever since. I haven't eaten animal products in over 20 years. The feeling in my heart of I don't have to kill something to live, that came later, which I am still grateful for. However, for me, it started as a resources thing. And I came to your work after I had chosen this pathway. And so to speak to you is quite a thrill, man. I'm not going to lie.
That's terrific. That's great. I think there's a lot of converging reasons on why we should be not eating animal products. And obviously one of them is the waste of resources and land. Increasingly, we realize also that greenhouse gases are produced by a lot of the meat products that people are eating, and that's a bad thing. But also, for me, in fact, though my concern was about animals, it wasn't specifically about killing them. It was more about the suffering that we inflict on them. That was really what got me going into this. When I learnt that, this is back in the early 1970s, when I learnt that animals were being taken off the fields and crowded indoors in sheds where they never got out to walk freely or see the sunlight, and that essentially they became machines for converting low-priced grain or soy into high-priced animal products. And that seemed to me to be quite wrong, that it was the profitability of the enterprise and not the well-being of the animals had nothing to do with it. So that's what first moved me away from it. But I know a lot of people have moved in because of the wastage of resources in animal industries in particular.
And don't get me wrong. We have a somewhat similar background. I'm the child of two Euros. My father is Czech. My mother was Lithuanian, and so it was meat or meat. Bugger the Australian climate, who cares? It's Sunday, kids. There's a pig's head in the oven, and it's Zutz time, So that's all that I knew. And it was, for many people, it's a very difficult thing because food is love, and food relates to our parents, and food relates to our sense of home and belonging, and a communication of love that is non-verbal, that can be given by a family member to you. So I understand why it's difficult for people to approach this sort of stuff.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I also had parents from Central Europe, so there's some of that background. But also, I mean, just growing up in Australia in the 50s, meat was the basic thing. Barbecues, lamb chops meat was there at certainly twice a day. Some people had 3 times a day, but I was mostly twice a day, and I assumed that was just what everybody did for quite a long time, and it really wasn't until I went to Oxford as a graduate student, so I was already in my early 20s, that I started thinking about this as an important moral issue. I think people didn't at that stage. It was really rare to meet a vegetarian, let alone a vegan. You wouldn't have known what the word vegan meant at that time.
I can only imagine. I mean, even now, it's been 20 years, but people still sometimes, not all the time, but people sometimes take it quite personally when I tell them, no, I don't eat meat. They sometimes can take it as an attack on their choices. I can't imagine what it was like to communicate that 40-something years ago to people who had never known anything different.
Well, there was certainly that sense that you were criticizing the way they were living, and to some extent that's true. But much more than there was the sense that you were a crank. In fact, the best vegetarian restaurant, I don't know that there was a vegan restaurant in London then, but the best vegetarian restaurant was actually called Cranks. And then there was a second vegetarian restaurant called the Nut House. And both of them sort of conveyed this idea that people thought vegetarians were cranks or nuts. So you had to overcome that sort of level of ridicule first, that people had thought you'd somehow, gone off the deep end and become some kind of crank to have stopped eating meat.
When you were a young person growing up in Australia, was there any clue? Did later on, when you spoke to the older people around you, was there any clue that you would end up in ethics? Were you particularly, the kind of kid that was had a particular sense of justice?
I don't really think so, to be honest. Not when I was young. I think that started really in the 60s when I was an undergraduate at Melbourne University, and so I was, already 18 anyway, not younger than that. And there were a couple of things that happened then. One was that although I'd originally planned to do a law degree, when I went to Melbourne University, I spoke to a counsellor who noticed that I'd done well in subjects like history and literature and suggested that I combine the law degree with an arts degree. Thought that might be more interesting. And then when I thought about, yes, okay, that's a nice idea, what will I do as part of the arts degree? I wanted to do history because I was always interested in that. But my sister's boyfriend at the time, later husband, she's an older sister, had done some philosophy, and I talked to him about it, and that sounded interesting. So I went into philosophy, and in philosophy I was particularly interested in ethics. That struck me as the sort of, if you like, the part where the rubber hits the road, where philosophy starts to make a difference to how you live. So I had that interest, and then at the same time the Vietnam War was going on, and I became part of the movement against the Vietnam War, and So there was a big ethical issue that was affecting my life, and I was part of that more radical student left, I suppose. But I still wasn't thinking about the treatment of animals at all, really. As I say, that only came when I went to Oxford as a graduate student. That didn't seem a serious issue. That seemed like a kind of sentimental issue for animal lovers, and I didn't really identify as an animal lover.
But to protest against the Vietnam War in that time in Australia, you were an Australian-born male, you were of age, conscription was a thing that you were, that was coming your way, wasn't it?
Oh yes, sure. There was a lottery for that at that time. Sort of missed earlier on. There'd been a shorter period of conscription for everybody. I think when they turned 18, then the government changed it to somewhat more selective when you turned 20, and there was a lottery, and I drew a lucky marble. I got a card saying that I was not required at that time, so I was fortunate for that. But certainly some of my friends did get conscripted, and of course some conscripts were being sent to Vietnam. So yeah, that was a prospect to worry about, at least until I got the lucky marble.
I actually know, as a mate of mine, one of his good friends went to university as a mature age student, and they actually went to university together. And he went to our school growing up. He was 30 years older than us, and he was conscripted. He was 18. He was the duck to the school, and he was conscripted. And I can't imagine what it would be like. 18 years old, no, you have absolutely no choice. You are going to go to this training camp. You are going to wear this uniform. We are going to give you this gun. You are going to get on this plane or boat, as it were. You are going to then get in a truck, and then you are going to go out to this field, and you are going to go shoot somebody. Like, and it pardon the French,
Yeah.
it fucked his life. It completely fucked his life.
Really, yeah. Well, that's certainly
And
understandable.
that's really tough.
Yeah. I had planned, if I did get conscripted, I'd planned to become a conscientious objector. Now, the problem with that was that at that stage, I think the courts were recognizing people who were conscientious objectors because of some religious view and were complete pacifists. But I wasn't religious, and I may not have qualified. I could still have simply refused to take part, and then I might have spent some time locked up for being disobeying orders or something like that. But I wasn't going to go and fight in Vietnam. I think I'd been pretty decided about that.
Yeah, it's particularly now as we are watching war unfold in this, full on like live stream Twitter stream of cataclysm upon Ukraine. The idea that you have no choice, and this may seem immoral and it may seem completely against your values, but you have no choice, and we're going to take you over there. And if you say no, we're going to put you in prison, so you can't be amongst any of your friends or family or your career. Like, yeah, I understand why you would have protested, is what I'm trying to say, Peter. I get it.
Yeah. I do, and I sympathise, I have to say, with some of the Russian soldiers, because I was just reading that interviews that some of them had after being captured by the Ukrainians, in which they'd said, they thought that they were going to the border for military exercises, for drills, and they weren't even told that they were going to be invading Ukraine until they were over the border as part of the drills, and then they were told, this is not a drill. We're now going to fight the Ukrainians, and you're there, you're part of it. It's a terrible thing, but I don't think of them as necessarily evil. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The old bait and switch. Oi, that's hard, man. That's very hard. As someone who gets right stuck into philosophy, I guess you're ultimately searching for what makes people act and the way they act. And as we, to use Ukraine as an example, sometimes people can find ways to justify their behavior, and they can reverse engineer it to anything to fit a narrative. Is what you're doing in the space of ethics and philosophy, is it trying to find like a core North Star that we can all kind of look at and work from? Is that really it?
I think it is, yes. And in fact, your title, Better Than Yesterday, comes close to it, right? I think the North Star, if you want to call it that, is trying to make the world a better place, doing what you can to reduce suffering in the world in particular, and increase happiness as well, to the extent that that's possible. But it's usually easier to focus on reducing suffering. That's easier to know how to do that than to make people happy. So, I think the common thread in all the work I do, whether it's about animals, whether it's about global poverty and trying to assist people in extreme poverty, whether it's about smaller issues like physician-assisted dying, those are things where I say, well, there's unnecessary suffering going on here, and we could change that. We could make a difference. So to me, that's the most important thing for us to aim at doing if we want to live an ethical life, in addition to obeying sort of general moral rules like trying to be honest and not harming people and so on. But trying to make the world better, trying to reduce suffering, not just not inflicting it ourselves, but helping others to reduce suffering. I think those are the important ethical guides that we ought to really be thinking about.
Watching the young people in your life that you are intimately related to come online and grow up, do you feel that we kind of all come out like that? Are we hardwired to try to not inflict suffering and try to reduce suffering in each other?
I don't think we're all the same. I do think that there are some common tendencies in all or most human beings, and one of them is certainly to think about our own interests and the interests of those who we're really close to, particularly family, loved ones, close friends, to think of those ahead of the interests of strangers. I think that's something that's given to us by the evolution of our ancestors. Our ancestors were more likely to survive if they thought of themselves and their kin ahead of strangers. So I think that's there. But I think a sense of compassion and a certain degree of empathy is present for most people, fortunately, but not everybody. And I think there's literature about people who are psychopaths, and unfortunately, there are some people who don't really feel any empathy with others. Sometimes don't even think about their own future very much. So there are problems about that. But most people, fortunately, I think you can talk about ethics. You can talk about putting yourself in the position of others who are affected by your action. Imagine what it's like to be a person in extreme poverty who watches their child die because they can't get even the most basic medicines or healthcare. Even imagine what it's like to be a pig in a factory farm, unable to move around freely and transported to slaughter and so on. So most people are prepared to think about that. And quite a few people are prepared to say, yes, that matters, and I don't want to support that. But there's a lot of other pressures as well, of course, conformist pressures, not wanting to stand out from others, doing what you're in the habit of doing, what your family does. So it's not easy for everybody to do that. But I think fortunately, there is elements of what we might call an ethical approach to living in the overwhelming majority of people.
We are, and I know, I'm sure people would like to think that they live ethically, and they do try to do the best they can. Yet if you're anywhere from lower middle class and up, if you're listening to this, you own at least some sort of internet connected device. So you're lower middle class and up. Therefore, I would just broadly say that you and I have all been born into a system that has essentially made a lot of ethical choices for us. Therefore, meat production or burning fossil fuels, and our life is amazing because of it. We haven't had to think about it. We have clean water comes out of my tap, Peter, from a dam hundreds of kilometres away, and I can drink it and not die of cholera. Like, it's a miracle. But there's ethical choices that have been made. Land got flooded, what wildlife habitat got destroyed. There's all kinds of things that I had. And so that choice has kind of been made for me, and I directly benefit from it. When we're trying to make an ethical choice from within the system that we live in, let's talk about modern Australia, for example. It might be how you use energy or how you get from place to place or what you eat. How can people start trying to nudge their thinking, not even their choices, just nudge their thinking closer towards making an ethical choice outside of this habitual system that we're all in?
I think it's a matter of expanding the circle of those beings who we're concerned about and thinking about our effect on them. So if you consider energy, for example, we are very fortunate in the ways that you suggested, but we need to think in this case about people who are going to be living in the future. Maybe there are children or grandchildren already, but also even further in the future than that. And we need to think about people in other countries who are much more dependent on weather patterns and much less able to protect themselves from floods, droughts, storms, and so on, who are going to be much worse off than we are as climate change continues and as rainfall patterns become less stable. Maybe hundreds of millions of people dependent on rainfall who are going to have to move because the rainfall will stop or will become less regular. So that's the kind of thing that we need to think about, and therefore to try to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions, but also to try to support those political parties, those groups who are trying to reduce climate change, who are serious about reducing climate change. So that's one example of ethical choices that we have to make in the way we're living.
But Peter, I'm busy. I've got to pick up the kids from jiu-jitsu. After I take the other one to netball, I've got to swing past music class to drop the other one off while I get then I've got to put a load on the laundry on. It's raining, so I've got to put the thing in the dryer and then bung dinner in the oven. Who's got time to think about these things, and how can I think about something in 50 years or in 80 years? How can I think about something in Fiji or sub-Saharan Africa? How can we break out of that sort of this whirlwind that we can find ourselves in modern life and start thinking about that stuff?
I think we can. I think a lot depends on who we're mixing with and what people take for granted. So, there's if your friends think that it's normal to do some of these things, to use public transport more, to do the things that you mentioned, or if you can't do that, to find, think about whether you can at least have a hybrid car of some sort, or perhaps electric vehicles, which are becoming more available and less expensive. Think about those changes as they become more normal. That can help. And of course, getting back to what we were talking about, what we eat, the greater availability of plant-based foods today does make it a lot easier to think about that. And that's relevant both to the treatment of animals, to climate change, and to not wasting resources in general, as well as health aspects, which I think are influential for many people, and wisely so. So I think as things shift, if you're part of that shifting in how people are living, what they're buying, and for that matter, what they're doing to help others, I think that can become part of that busy lifestyle. Perhaps not so easily, but it can be.
Even in the time that I've been eating this way, to walk down the aisle at Coles, where we get our groceries from, and see Coles branded tempeh. This is a massive, massive corporation that owns squillions of hectares of land, and they, somewhere in a focus group, have gone, we're losing money to this tempeh company. Quick, let's make some tempeh. All right. It blows my mind.
Oh, it's fantastic, of course, yeah, and it's happening in lots of things. I mean, one of the things that started quite a few years ago was the plant-based milk products. The soy milk or almond milk or oat milk, what it is now, and that's now got a significant share of the market, and nobody thinks that's strange anymore. When I first got into this, as I say, in the 70s, I was living in England, and you couldn't get any plant-based milks in the supermarkets. There was a health food shop in Oxford. There was one shop that was selling soy milk. You had to go there and get it, and it wasn't cheap either. So a lot of things have changed in that respect, and it's definitely good to see that the big companies are investing in this too.
You mentioned personal choices, how you get around or what you eat. Where do you see the line as far as, let's take the current example in Brisbane. Wivenhoe Dam was built after the 1974 floods as a flood mitigation strategy. And, it's worked variously well, or not well, depending on how it's operated, I guess. Where's the line between, the weather's changing, you need to flood-proof your house, it's your personal choice, versus the weather's changing, we're going to build a bigger dam? Where do you see, when it comes to climate, when it comes to agriculture, where do you see that tipping point that a government should go, actually, this is our responsibility, it's no longer personal responsibility?
I think there's always a personal responsibility to do what you can. I don't think we should just rely on governments and say it's up to them to make sure that everything works out okay. So yes, if it's feasible to flood-proof your house, then you should be doing it. But it may not be feasible for everyone. It may be in some cases. Looking at what's happened in Lismore, it may be that really people need to move. I mean, that's going to be tough, but it seems like the level of flooding there is getting worse, and it's going to repeat itself, no doubt. Not in 100 years, but in the next decade or so, probably. So, what can be done about that? I can't answer that question, but certainly people as individuals should be doing what they can and not relying on governments. But they should be working for the changes in policy that can make a difference there. And clearly, this is climate change related. We don't get, as you said at the beginning, we don't get three times in a decade or so, once in 100-year floods. We have to change the way we're thinking about this. So our government should be pulling its weight in doing that, should be among the leading governments in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, getting to net zero. And we're not. And we should be thinking about that and supporting the politics that will do that.
We're often faced, and certainly in the climate, I guess I won't say it what it isn't, Peter, like in the denial of these facts in the last 2-3 decades, the moral reprehensible concept of taking coal jobs away has always been painted as way worse. And how dare you do such a bad thing versus, trying to keep people's homes safe. That I've always found interesting, using that argument of like it's your fault that this hard-working blue-collar person lost their job because you don't want to burn coal anymore. And I've always found that like a kind of shitty argument when it comes to what's clearly a better environmental solution, but let's be honest, a better economic solution. What can you do with free energy or near free energy? Tons. You can do a lot. And it's really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I find that a bit of a dirty, I find it a dirty trick.
Well, I mean, again, you've got to feel empathy for people who have been working in the coal industry and losing their jobs.
Yeah.
But that's something where the government needs to make sure that there are opportunities for them, that they can be retrained, or if they're at an age where they feel they can't be retrained, to provide support for them. We don't want to hurt people, but yeah, we learn that some things that we did in the past were not good. It's the same in the tobacco industry, right? I mean, if tobacco at least in Australia, used to be far more people smoking, and no doubt tobacco companies had lots of people working there, and the demand in many countries, not all of them, unfortunately, has greatly diminished. But you don't want people to be getting lung cancer so that you can keep people in jobs, and the problems with the coal industry are just as serious. They may be on a larger scale, they may be somewhat less visible, but the consequences are there, and they're catastrophic if we continue to burn large quantities of coal.
There seems to be quite an intersection of the work that you've been doing, the headline work that you've been doing over the years around animal ethics and the treatment of animals, around environmentalism and around extreme poverty, and that all these three things are kind of coming together around climate, a supergroup, if you will. Like a similar solution can work across the board. When people are elected into power in this country, they're often quite heavily influenced by industries outside of government, which hold a lot of sway. What message would you have around this kind of stuff for whoever does get the top job in come May?
So I think the message is that if you have the top job, you have a heavy responsibility. You have a responsibility for the future of our own country and contributing, as we were saying, to stopping the catastrophic floods or the droughts. And Australia is like that. We're going to have more extremes. We've had more extreme floods just now. That's part of La Nina. We're going to have El Nino coming around in a few years, and we'll probably have more extreme droughts. So it's really important to protect the future of Australia and to contribute to reducing climate change as far as possible. We're not going to stop it altogether, and it's really important to think about people in other countries, as we were saying, who are less able to protect ourselves. And I would also like, although this is not very popular electorally at the moment, but I do think we ought to be thinking more about making Australia's foreign aid more effective than it has been, and going back to the levels that it used to be, because Australia's foreign aid has dropped quite shamefully now, and we're giving less and less than we used to give. But that's something that we ought to go back to, and we ought to make sure that it's as effective as possible. That's the other thing that I'm involved with through the effective altruism movement, not just of encouraging people to be altruistic, but encouraging them to use their head as well as their heart, so that they select the causes that are really going to make the biggest difference with the resources that they have available. And I think Australia's government needs to do that as well.
When it does come to charitable giving, as Australians, to be asked to give to someone in our suburb, it can kind of make a bit of sense. We may see someone who's sleeping rough, outside the nearby shopping centre, or, we may see someone sleeping in their car and go, well, that's near my house. I understand this. This person had, exposed to the same society I came up, I'm guessing. I understand why this person needs help, or this particular homeless shelter needs help, or this particular other charity near me needs help. But what about, let's just say, someone living 50 centimetres above the waterline in high tide mark in Bangladesh? Why would someone from Kenmore, which is near where I grew up in Brisbane, why should they care about a person 8,000 kilometres away? And why is it in their interest to do so?
Well, I think we need to be able to empathise with people who are far away and speak different languages or have different cultures. And one of the differences, I think, between the two situations you mentioned, trying to help the homeless person in our own suburb and helping people in low-income countries, is that you can often do a lot more with the same resources, even though they're further away. Because they're in low-income countries, there are ways of helping them that are much simpler. So sometimes, for example, giving people cash grants. There's an organisation called Give Directly, which gives people cash grants of around $1,000. Now, $1,000 for somebody in Australia who's homeless is probably not going to make a life-changing difference. It's not enough. But $1,000 for somebody living in a low-income country who's in extreme poverty, as the World Bank measures that. Let's say they're earning less than $2 a day, to US dollars that is, but still, say $2.50 or something Australian, $3. So $1,000 is their annual income, or more than their annual income, and that can make a huge difference. That can give them a chance to do things that they could never have done before. To start a small business, to replace their leaky thatched roof with an iron roof that keeps their food supplies and other things dry. So I think we ought to be thinking about people elsewhere in the world, because they are very much poorer than us. They don't have, you were mentioning the safe drinking water that comes out of the tap. They may not have that. They may not have any basic health care. They may not have mosquito nets to sleep under so that they and their children don't get malaria. There's a whole lot of things that we can do for them very cheaply. Some of them may be blind, and when they could have their cataracts removed, and that's also something that every Australian can get. So there are opportunities there for doing more good for fewer resources, that I think is why we should be thinking about people who are far away from us, who are strangers, in preference even to people who are closer. And I'm not saying we shouldn't help people who are close, but where the problems are difficult ones, where they're quite costly ones to fix, I don't think we should necessarily just be saying, well, these people live in my suburb and therefore I'm going to help them, in preference to using the same funds to make much bigger life-changing differences, perhaps in several people in low-income countries.
I'm not a person that particularly believes in any kind of deity. I personally believe that when I die, my molecules just go into the ground and become a part of the universe that becomes other food. And the fact that I then rejoin the rest of matter and then live on in a squillion different objects and beings and creatures is incredible, and that's enough for me. I know other people prefer to have some sort of, oh, if I do good in this life, then there's a life where, an afterlife where things are amazing. But in the absence of, well, I do charitable goods, I do charitable works, and I give money to this country and this person in a low income country, so I can then get into the big shop, get my ticket to the VIP after party, and everything's going to be okay. In the absence of that, because it's a bit of a slightly selfish reason. I'm giving to charity
Yes.
because good deeds will, earn my ticket to the after show.
I'll go to heaven afterwards. Yes.
Yeah. In the absence of that, what good comes to someone in my position? What good comes to me from giving my money to a person in another country? How do I personally, is there an equivalent? How do I personally gain from that?
There is an equivalent in this life, and like you, I don't believe that there is any other life for us. But the equivalent is leading a more meaningful and more fulfilling life for yourself. And I've been working in this area as well from roughly the same time when I stopped eating animals. So back in the 1970s, I've been working to help organizations helping people in extreme poverty. And over the last 10 years or so with the organization The Life You Can Save, which recommends the most effective charities for people to donate to. So I've had a lot of contact with people who've come out and donated to these organizations. And the common theme that I get for them is that they're really more satisfied with their lives, that it's given meaning to their lives that they didn't have. And so particularly when people are reasonably successful financially, and then they start wondering, well, what should I do with this money? Yes, I can buy a bigger house or a fancier car, or I can wear one of those expensive mechanical watches that don't tell the time any better than the little, cheap electronic watches. But really, what's the point of that? And then when they start realizing that they can make a difference to so many other people, that they can really use that for some important purpose. So many people feel satisfied with that, and because the organization is called The Life You Can Save, and people have said to me, well, the first life I saved is my own, because not that I was going to die, but I've given meaning and purpose to my life, and I'm more satisfied with what I'm doing. I feel good about it in a way where previously I wasn't really getting that satisfaction out of life.
Do you think there's an evolutionary reason that we get this sense of well-being from helping other people?
I'm sure it has a basis in the fact that we're social animals. Humans have lived in social groups since before we were humans, as our close relatives, the great apes, are generally, well, certainly chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas are social animals, less so orangutans. So that's part of it, I think, that we have that sense of being with others and helping others. Lots of observations of people among social mammals helping others. But there's more to it than that. And the other factor is our ability to reason and to think of ourselves as similar to others, and to think of others as having needs like us and making a difference. So I think that's why we don't just help those in our immediate group in the way that other social mammals typically do. There are some cases of social mammals helping others outside the group too. Famous cases, for instance, of dolphins helping somebody who's in danger of drowning and sort of pushing them to the surface like they might one of their own. So that can certainly happen. But I think in our case it's important that we are capable of seeing others as similar to ourselves and experiencing their needs and thinking that, well, if it matters to me, it matters to them. It's a kind of a golden rule sort of thing, putting yourself in the place of others and saying, I shouldn't be doing what I wouldn't want others to do to me. So that's part of it. Now, of course, our capacity to reason is also something that we have thanks to evolution. It helped us to survive. Instead of being able to run extremely fast or having very sharp teeth or claws or something, our great evolutionary advantage is the ability to think think, solve problems, and survive that way. So yes, we have this ability to reason from evolution, but it's the combination of that ability to reason, putting ourselves in the position of others, and being able to empathize with those others that leads us to have the capacity for the broader ethical reach, for the expanding circle of moral concern that goes to all of those beings capable of suffering.
While we're here, because what you just spoke about, I'm pretty sure most people would have been able to follow along to, like, yes, this makes sense to me. Like, as a human, I am just one of many humans, and if I help and I can try to see that humans that even I don't know experience pain and loss and fear and suffering the similar as me. So if I can help them, I can help myself, and together we can all be better. As humans, though, we think of others and, think that they have the same rights that I want, et cetera, et cetera. But that kind of there's an edge of that. It ends at humans. Beyond that, when it comes to river systems, the air, the oceans, fish, animals, do you think we need to start expanding that circle to consider ourselves not just as humans and then everything else, but we are a part? All of this can only happen if everything happens?
I certainly think we need to expand beyond humans to other beings capable of suffering, and that means at least most non-human animals. You could say certainly all vertebrates, I think, are capable of suffering, but some invertebrates are as well. If people have seen the Octopus, My Teacher movie, you know that an octopus is an intelligent being capable of suffering, and so that's a mollusk that's capable of suffering. In Britain, they're adding, as well as adding octopus and squid, the cephalopods, they're also adding what are called decapod crustaceans. That means lobsters and crabs in particular, as capable of suffering. So there's legislation in the British Parliament now, and there's a couple of other countries that have already done that. So there are invertebrates capable of suffering as well. But I'm not saying that all non-human animals, that all insects or oysters, simpler mollusks like oysters, I'm not saying that they're capable of suffering. But so for me, that's the important question. Is there sentience? Is there capacity to suffer? When you talk about ecosystems and rivers and so on, they're tremendously important for the future of our own future and for that of non-human animals capable of suffering as well. I'm not somebody who says that an ecosystem is itself a kind of conscious entity or anything of that sort. So I think I'd be prepared to say that the value and importance of the ecosystem or the river is for those sentient beings who depend on them rather than intrinsically. And that's why nature is important. That's why it's catastrophic that we're destroying forests and climate change is ruining the Great Barrier Reef, for example. Those sorts of things are tragedies, but they're tragedies for the sentient beings who live there and appreciate them and want them, not so much for the coral or the trees themselves.
Yeah, they're very pretty to go and snorkel on, but you got to remember that the manta rays like to live there. The manta rays like to live just as much as anyone else. And if you've ever been scuba diving and seen a manta ray swim past you, like, I challenge you to find something more majestic. It's a stunning creature to witness, stunning. And if you don't feel touched by the pure, astonishing, incredible incredulity that creature even exists in that moment, then you and I need to sit down and have a chat. It's amazing.
Okay, I haven't scuba dived with a manta ray. I have.
Let's go. You learn how to surf at 50, mate. Let's scuba. Let's go.
I wouldn't mind, but I have surfed with dolphins. That was pretty amazing too. Watch a dolphin surfing a wave and jumping out of the wave, and obviously enjoying it. That's terrific too.
That's truly something. You were in the inception of the Australian Greens Party here in Australia. What do you remember about that time?
Yeah, that was very exciting. I was a founding member of the Victorian Greens when the Greens were sort of starting to form as a national political party rather than some different state organizations. I was a great admirer of Bob Brown and the struggle that he had, the campaign to save the Franklin, and what he was doing in general. He was clearly a forerunner and a pioneer and a far-sighted person, still is, of course, who can see what's happening. And I wanted to contribute to that and to support that. It wasn't so much that I was hopeful that the Greens would achieve government, but rather that they would drive other political parties, particularly the Australian Labor Party, I was thinking of, to occupy more of that ground, that if they saw a smaller party taking votes from them, they would realise that if they did not have strong environmental policies, then they were going to lose seats to them, which obviously has happened to some extent, but it would be good if it happened to a much greater extent.
Sometimes, and it's been obviously talked about a lot during the time that Trump was in power, that the success of the right, essentially, has sometimes been attributed to it's very easy for the right to organize. It's like, this is good, this is bad, you're with us or against us, let's go. And left can have a problem because they start to fracture quite quickly. Did you experience any of that at all?
The Greens were not in danger of fracturing when I was active there. It was quite difficult to reach decisions because, at least at that time, the Greens tried to reach decisions by consensus. They didn't want to vote and have majority decisions prevail. And that's wonderful, but it's idealistic. And sometimes, if you're going to achieve consensus, you spend a very long time talking about and discussing issues. And in the end, perhaps the consensus is achieved because some people can just stay there and keep talking all night, and other people have to get up and go home and maybe look after their children or whatever it might be. So it's not ideal. And yes, it is the case that there may be splits. In one way, we're politically fortunate in Australia in that we have preferential voting for the lower house and proportional representation for the Senate, and so the splits are less catastrophic than they are in the United States, where in 2000, I was already in the United States teaching at Princeton in 2000 when Al Gore, who had a strong concern for climate, was against George W. Bush. And essentially that came down to whether Florida would end up tipping its votes to Gore or Bush. And Ralph Nader was running in Florida for the Greens. And I think if I remember rightly, he got something like 80,000 votes. And Bush won the election by 500 votes. So, it's pretty clear, I think, that if there had been preferential voting, let's say at least 60,000 of those 80,000 votes that went for Nader would have gone to Gore, and he would have won Florida quite comfortably and would have been president. And who knows how different the future of the world would have been then, right? I mean, not just better for climate change, but maybe he wouldn't have attacked Iraq in the way that Bush did, and all of the catastrophic consequences that flowed from that.
I can only imagine. There's a story, I've told this on the show before, but there's a mate of mine, his father's in his 80s, and his father met his mother at a Liberal Party dance in the 60s. They were young Liberals at university, and they shared similar morals and similar, ideas about what the world should look like. And he's now in his 80s, and he votes Green. And my mate asked him and said, what happened? And he said, no, I never changed. How I feel about the world never changed. Just who had the policies that aligned with how I feel about the world changed. And now the Greens are the people, which kind of blows my mind that the Liberal Party in the 70s and 80s had policies that could have been Greens policies.
Well, if you're conservative in the full sense, I guess you want to conserve some of the good things about the world, and not just allow business to take them over and get its way. So yeah, policies have changed. Again, and that's certainly also true in the United States, where the Republicans have just moved so crazily far to the right with Trump and with Trump supporters, and the sort of more liberal Republicans who used to be around, people like Nelson Rockefeller, for example, who had fairly liberal policies. Even Richard Nixon, who I was totally opposed to because of support for the war in Vietnam. But, even he wanted to bring in a sort of universal healthcare system in the United States, which they still don't have. And, now the Republicans are very far from that. Yeah, the right has often moved further to the right, and sometimes you're right. It could be that you haven't changed, but the parties have changed.
As we go towards this election, I'd like to remind people that as Australians, our governments have sometimes done really incredible and inspiring things. In your view, what are the high watermarks as far as ethics go that our government has done that you go, that it makes me proud. I'm proud that we did that as a country.
Well, perhaps the biggest change for me was when Gough Whitlam's government was elected, and more or less immediately it ended conscription, and there were draft resistors on the run who were criminals before the government was elected, who ceased to be criminals. It ended conscription, and then it very rapidly pulled out of the Vietnam War, and so they were dramatic changes that governments had made. But there are certainly other important things that you achieved through politics. I think the whole Keating government did a lot of good things. Clearly, and actually going back to Whitlam too, the first land rights for Indigenous people were something that that Whitlam government did, and I think Keating still felt strongly about Indigenous people and made that wonderful Redfern speech. I'd say that the role that under the whole Keating government, the role that Gareth Evans played, I must admit he's a personal friend of mine. I went to university with him and have known him ever since. But the role that he played in a number of issues in helping to bring peace in Cambodia. He was an important negotiator in what happened there. And the Chemical and Biological Weapons Treaty, he also played a really important role in. So those are things that I've been really proud that our government has done.
So we are capable of more than holding a lump of coal in Parliament and saying, don't be afraid of it. There's things that we can do that are quite inspiring.
Yeah. That's right. We can be a respected nation, obviously a middle-ranking nation, not a great power, but a middle-ranking nation that can play an important role in bringing other nations together.
How do you think, as we're heading towards this election, how do you think we are doing as a country? Are we cynical? Are we hopeless? Are we hopeful? What do you think?
So it's hard for me to really estimate that. I think there are certainly a lot of people who are very hopeful and who are moving in the right direction. I think the last election was very disappointing. We were hopeful of getting a better government that would be more concerned about climate change and about a range of other policies as well. We didn't get it. I don't know quite where we're going to be going this time. Because obviously you mix with people who tend to share your views and have the same sort of political views, and are hoping for Labor to get back in with Green support, perhaps to keep them environmentally honest. That's what I would like to see. But I have to admit that Morrison is convincing a number of people. He is, I think, trying to have that impact on people. He's saying things that may sound good, but I would say are not really trustworthy in terms of where the government is going. So, are people taken in by that, or are they seeing through it? I'm not enough of an expert to answer that.
He's certainly very good at his job. Absolutely, he's very, very good at his job of getting and keeping power. The things that you've been talking about your whole, kind of public-facing career, animal rights, and environmental protection, and extreme poverty. These things, at least in our part of the world, yes, they're important to think about it, but they never threatened my home, my way of life. They never threatened my actual life. Peter, how close are we going to have to get till it's I mean, sure that we lost people. Many people died in these recent floods. How close are we going to have to get to? No, you're actually at risk of death if you don't change now. Like, where do we as humans generally wait until we hit go on a change?
I'm hoping that in Australia we're not going to get to that point in the foreseeable future. That I mean, as you say, it will happen for some people. Undoubtedly, it will happen through floods. It will happen through droughts. But I'm hoping we won't get to that sense of our own lives really being in peril. Probably the most obvious way that we would get there would be through nuclear war in the near future. And of course, Putin has been putting his nuclear weapons on a higher level of alert and saying that he would use them, threatening that. I mean, that's a horrendous situation. And yet I also do think that he has to be stopped. I think if Putin is able to succeed in turning Ukraine into a puppet state, then that won't be the last thing that he tries to do. He will turn his attention to other states with Russian minorities, maybe the Baltic states like Latvia and Estonia, and their NATO parts of NATO. So the threat of war is definitely there again in a way that it wasn't just a couple of months ago, and that's somewhat scary. And again, although we would not be the most immediately affected, that would probably be in Europe. But I'm old enough to remember the movie On the Beach. Based on the novel, in which Melbourne was the last major city on Earth to still be around as the nuclear cloud and the radiation circled the planet. So let's just hope it won't get to that point. But that would seem to me the most immediate threat. But as I say, other countries are in greater need, and I do think that's given that we're an affluent country, that's where we should be focusing.
You have been married for a very long time. You've married 50 years. What would your wife say about what it's like to be married to a philosopher when it comes time to, I don't know, Peter, have you taken the bins out?
I took the bins out last night. Yes, I don't think that changes very much. I don't think I don't get any special privileges as a philosopher that somehow.
No, I'm not saying that not like when it comes to like getting any altercations with you. Like, I mean, surely you have tips as a married couple.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, we have tips, but they tend not to be philosophical ones. That's one of the great things that I think that our values perhaps evolved. We were both starting from the same political side of the spectrum, undoubtedly, when we got together. But in terms of the things that we've been talking about, like not eating animals, like contributing a significant part of our income to help people in extreme poverty, to give to the most effective charities we can find. Those are things that happened after we got together, but we agreed on them, and it was much easier for me to do these things because Renata, my wife, was supportive of those ideas, and once we thought about them, thought that they were good things to do, so we did it together, and that was a great support. So fortunately, we've evolved together, and we mostly see eye to eye on those sorts of things. Not everything, but in terms of the most important things about how we live. Maybe she's kept me a little bit more down to earth.
What about you, Peter? Obviously you think about some pretty heavy stuff all day long, every day. You have intense conversations. I dare say there's very few conversations that you have in your waking hours that are not intense. How do you recover? How do you recharge? How do you give your brain space to consider, I've been thinking this whole time, is it still the right thing?
Oh, so yeah, I do think over things. That takes time generally, and that comes through discussions with other people or with other philosophers. It leads me to change my views on those issues. But in terms of recovering, it's not that I'm thinking about philosophical questions all the time. I do think it's really important to have breaks. That's one of the things that I love about nature, and that my wife and I share. We both enjoy being out in nature. Hiking is probably the major form of recreation that we do together. We go for walks, we get into nature, we relax, we don't discuss philosophy or big things usually as we're hiking. And then the other things are being with family. As you said, I have children and grandchildren. Fortunately, they're all in Melbourne, so that's terrific. We can stay close, see a lot of them, and do things together. Where again, we're really just living ordinary family lives. Sometimes I'll talk to my grandchildren about some philosophical issues, just talking about what's going on in Ukraine with them recently, even a little bit with the youngest of them, who's 8. But not all the time. No, a lot of it is just the normal things that any parents and grandparents do.
But it's nice to hear that you've found this thing that I'm sure that if the days or weeks have gone by when you haven't been able to go for a hike or you haven't been able to see your family, that your work suffers, surely.
It suffers. Look, there's two things going on. It means that I have more time to get into it and without interruptions. So that's a good thing. Yeah. Some of the things, if I'm writing something seriously, you don't want to be interrupted all the time because your train of thought gets interrupted and you don't go on. But you're missing others. You're missing those opportunities, and eventually, without the family and without the recreation together, you'll get stale, I think, and you'll burn out. That's the other thing. I've seen, again, in movements, the animal movement, and in people working very hard for charity, I've seen people who start up fully fired up, lots of enthusiasm. They really want to change things, particularly in the animal movement. They're horrified by factory farming. We've got to stop factory farming. So they go into the movement full time. They don't have the family connections or the occasions to rest and recuperate. And after a year or two, they're burned out, and they're not still going. So it's a loss. It's a pity. They would have done more good if they'd been somewhat less intense, and they would have been maybe working there for decades rather than for just a couple of years.
When faced with something as just colossal, I've heard it described as a hyperobject, the climate change, it's 100 million drastically difficult problems with a billion separate solutions. Like, how can you possibly contemplate sorting that out? Like, it's so overwhelming. We can freeze. How can we possibly move from a place of terror and fear to a place of action when it's just like mathematically impossible for our actions to feel like they're having any impact at all?
I think you have to do what is going to have some sort of impact, even if a very small one, and feel that you're playing a part in that. So again, when it comes to global poverty, people often say, well, whatever I could do would be a drop in the ocean. I can't, there's currently the World Bank says there's something between 700 and 800 million people in extreme poverty. What can I do about that? Even Bill Gates can't solve that problem, or, I guess Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk can't solve that problem. But we shouldn't think of it just like that. We should think about what we can do that is positive and making a difference. And the average middle class or above Australian can certainly save the lives of people in low-income countries by helping the most effective charities to protect them against malaria or to get them started in some sort of enterprise where they can lift themselves out of poverty. So, that's why I started The Life You Can Save, the organization, to help people find those effective charities where they can really make a difference. And I think it's a mistake to think if I can't solve the problem alone, can't solve the entire problem, it's not worth doing anything. That's a big problem that people think about that way, and it's a psychological barrier. But really, what we need to be doing is to do what we can to move things in the right direction. And of course, to encourage others to do that, set an example that they will follow, and then more people will do that. And then together, we can make that difference.
Peter, I'm so thrilled that you're going to do this speaking tour. Not just because it's nice to sit in a room full of people again after all these years of being stuck in my house. I love my family. Don't get me wrong, but it'd be nice. But also that you'll be speaking with one of my favorite people, Josh Zepps, who is an incredible human being and a brilliant thinker and blindingly smart and fast. And I'm just so excited to hear what you guys have to talk about. It's going to be great.
I'm looking forward to speaking to Josh and having those conversations in Sydney and Brisbane. And in Melbourne, where I'm speaking with Libby Gore, who's also, I think, great
She's
person.
fabulous.
She's terrific. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to these events in those three cities and having those conversations. And I hope lots of people will come along as we can all get together.
Yeah.
Definitely. And once New Zealand opens up a bit more, I'm planning to do it there too. I was originally arranged to go to Auckland as well, but it's not possible now. But hopefully it will be again later.
I had such a crush on Libby Gore when I was a kid. Oh, man.
Great.
I can't even tell you. I've told her. I've let her know. But boy, yeah. Peter, it's been just an absolute dream to speak to you today, mate. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Osher. Great to talk to you.